Hello, everybody. What thou wilt should be the whole of the law. Welcome to Little Essays Towards Truth seminar discussion. Um, we're on the hour. This is being recorded, so I'm just going to go ahead and start talking. And then I'm going to be talking for about half an hour to 40 minutes at least, and then we'll open to some questions and Q&A. So hello, everybody. We're talking about the book Little Essays Towards Truth, and supposedly we're using a phenomenological method. And I need to explain a little bit about what that is. So basically, phenomenology has widespread usage as a methodology in the 20th century, and there's no single particular version of it. So many different thinkers and figures use this method, and they use it in different ways. So there's not one phenomenology, there's several different kinds of phenomenology. So in a way, it might be best to see it as a way of asking questions rather than as a dogmatically closed system. And I will be leaning heavily on the version of phenomenology in Martin Heidegger's Being and Time from 1926, but this book is highly influential, and so it has a number of additional philosophers who have things to say about it, and so I will be referring to them from time to time. The method of phenomenology is, of course, most prominently founded in the early 20th century by a person by the name of Edmund Husserl, who's a German philosopher in the active largely in the 1920s, although also in other times as well. And rather than front load a lot of information about phenomenology, my plan as moving forward is that instead I'm going to define and develop the concepts as I go. Basically, though, my thesis in this course is that Aleister Crowley's thelemic method of skeptical theurgy, which he also sometimes calls scientific illuminism, which is the methodology of magic that he presents in Equinox and also in his other works. My claim is that this methodology, which is he defines in terms of a certain type of empirical pragmatism, which is also skeptical, when those three things are kind of combined together, the result is robustly similar to what will later in the 20s and 30s emerge as the phenomenological method. And so Crowley's methodology and phenomenology's methodology kind of converge in their approach. And therefore, these methodologies can broadly be conflated and brought into conversation with each other. And by doing that, what I'm also claiming is that, or the basic point that I'm making by doing that, is that thelema as a philosophy has always already been part of the conversation of modern Western philosophy. So rather than being an outlier or an exception or some kind of weird occult, sideshow, thelema is very much part of the mainstream of Western philosophy in this period. And then if we look at it through that lens, we're going to be able to see a lot more that's going on in magic. So if I wanted to say just what the basic idea of phenomenology is so that we can kind of get started with a conversation about how that relates to thelema and specifically how that relates to our text for the course, which is Little Essays Towards Truth. The very basic idea is that phenomenology is a way to examine things without allowing preconceptions to interfere with understanding how phenomena appear in and as themselves, how they show themselves as they are, as it were. The slogan in Husserl's phenomenology is that phenomenology allows access to the things themselves. Now, the issue with that is that looking is never innocent, and there's always preconceptions that we have when we're trying to examine or understand things. And so part of the phenomenological method is to, in bracketing those preconceptions, to also understand what they are, so that then when you're looking, you know what your preconceptions are. So let's go ahead and take a look now at our text. Let me bring this up. I thought I had this up a moment ago, but okay, there we go. Okay, so now I'm going to share my screen. And you should all be able to see, here's our text. Okay, so I'm just going to go down. I have my sidebar with the people who are participating. So Stephen, you're first on the screen, random selection. So if you could start reading from the top, and I'll tell you when to stop, which will be pretty quick. Go ahead and unmute your mic so we can hear you.
That is a necessary requirement. Man being the subject of these essays, it is first proper to explain what is meant therein by the word. Man
okay, stop right there, because that's going to be our first philosophical point in this essay, which is that the text begins asking a philosophical question regarding the definition of what we could call the definition of terms. So when we're doing a philosophical inquiry, we need to define our terms so that we can undergo philosophical analysis. This is also the starting point of Socratic inquiry. So in the Platonic dialogues, whenever Socrates appears as a character, somebody will come to him with some question or issue. And what he always does is he basically asks them to define their terms. So we'll say you have this particular preconception or certain ideas about these ideas that we're talking about, and let's make that explicit rather than implicit, because by making that explicit, we then begin to understand what the kind of inquiry that we're undertaking is. So the subject of our inquiry is man, or the human person. And this is going to be what is called the criterion, the guiding principle or focus of the philosophical questioning that we're undertaking. And so that means it's part of what we could call the prehension or pre-having of the inquiry that we're undertaking, is that our goal is to try to understand this specific, not just any phenomenon, but the specific phenomenon, which is the human existence or human person. And this person will be defined in terms of their relationship to a world, but not just any world, not even just reality itself as some kind of abstraction, but the world as it appears and is known to human beings. And so the interpretation of that, the philosophical terminology we have for that is hermeneutics. That's a seemingly complicated word, but it just means interpretation. So according to Heidegger, everything has, when we're engaged in interpreting things, which we always are when we're having experience, any experience that we have has already been interpreted in a certain way for us to be able to have that experience at all, which is another way of saying that to be a human being, being a human being is already interpreted for us as human beings, who are also the thing being interpreted in a certain way. And so the goal of this kind of basic philosophical inquiry is to become more explicit about what that is or what that means. This is what Heidegger calls the Seinfrage, the question of being, that he famously begins Being and Time with this question in the famous introduction. And short, quick spoiler for that question, it turns out that the thing to be interrogated to know what being is the being for which being is an issue, namely human existence. And so Crowley starts, just as Heidegger does, with answering the question of what is being, or what is reality, and what does it mean, or what is the meaning of life, or these sorts of spiritual questions, by first asking the question, what is a human person, and what does it mean to be a human person? What's the philosophical constitution, as it were, of human existence, such that the world has the appearance that it does for us and is able to appear as it is, and then have meaning and purpose for us. So Heidegger says that every hermeneutical inquiry has a certain forehaving or prehension. So in German, this is that it has a certain Vorhabe, or forehaving, Vorgriff, or foreconception, or Vorsicht, foresight. These are all synonymous. Making this structure explicit is part of the task of the phenomenological or philosophical method. But as I'm going to be arguing, it's also at the same time the basic first step of magical initiation. So in the AA system, the oath of the probation, are basically the first goal of magical practice, is to understand or investigate the nature and powers of one's being. Well, this is basically, I'm arguing, the same strategy as the Seinfrage, the questioning into being in phenomenology. These are synonymous methodologies, and I'm going to treat them as basically functionally being the same. So now what that means is that in phenomenology, we have a kind of curious situation then, which is that how things are seen, in a sense, determines what they are. And this is an inversion from what is usually taken to be the methodology of naive realism or reductive empiricism, which is the idea that reality is just this objective thing that's out there, and the human person is this, John Locke calls it a tabula rasa, a blank slate, literally in Latin, that just receives, is just open to impressions that come in, and then it just knows what the world objectively is by looking and investigating. And this viewpoint is inadequate to understand how we know things, because how we know things turns out to be much more complicated than that. And so hermeneutics is an attempt to get a little bit more sophisticated about what the pre-having is, the precognitive understanding that we already have of a world ahead of time, as it were, prior to experience, at least epistemically, such that we have the experience of the world that we actually have. So what this means is that Husserl had theorized what he calls the phenomenological epoche, which is a Greek word that means bracketing and refers to a kind of skeptical suspension of preconceptions. And he talked about it as, Husserl had talked about it as a bracketing of experience to suspend preconceptions. But what are these preconceptions? In other words, there's no such thing as a pure seeing. All experience is framed in terms of a kind of what in philosophy is called intentionality. In other words, experience is always experience of something. It has some positive content that can be analyzed and potentially understood. In other words, experience is of something by something. So for Husserl, Edmund Husserl, in the original version of phenomenology that he proposed, the experiencer of a world was something that he called consciousness. This comes obviously from the already existing philosophy of mind that emerges out of René Descartes in modern times. And Husserl defined consciousness as a continuum of intentional mental states that has a kind of internal noetic constitution that can then be analyzed by the phenomenological method. Now, without saying that this method is wrong, it does need to be made a little bit more complicated, because this remains a little bit too Cartesian and therefore dualistic. So then there's two things, mind and the external world, and it's hard to figure out how these two things fit together. So Martin Heidegger famously critiqued this approach, and he replaces the thing that knows or has experience with a phenomenological entity, which he calls Dasein, which is a German word that just means being there, or it can be defined as just a bare existence. In Hegel's logic, the word Dasein refers to an abstract existent thing that hasn't been defined yet in terms of any of its qualities. And so it's just abstract existence as such. And so Heidegger also uses that word, which he gets originally from Hegel's logic, and uses it as his sort of placeholder term for human existence, which then, through a phenomenological analysis, he's going to fill in with more content. So what he primarily means by Dasein, he being Heidegger, is a historically existing human person who exists as what he calls being in the world. And the in here is as distinguished from being above or alongside the world, in some other world, or understood like mind being in a different ontological category than body. And Heidegger wants to get away from that kind of dichotomous thinking. So human existence is always already fully within and part of the world that it is experiencing and participating in historically through various skills and practices that it has socially acquired as part of a historical narrative that it posits itself as being part of. So this way of conceiving the human existence is not ultimately reducible to Descartes' extended substance as nature, or so in other words, the world understood in a phenomenological method, according to this approach, means that the worldhood of the world can't be reduced to a reductive materialist account. The worldhood of the world has a kind of thematic totality, which is imparted to it through human activity in the world, through human historicity. And that totality or wholeness is not reducible to mere physical stuff that's present that is then supposed to amalgamate together to have meaning. The meaningfulness doesn't just emerge out of the amalgamation. It has to come from some other structure that is occurring. And this is the structure of what Heidegger calls being with a capital B. And what he means by that is a kind of intelligibility that the world has, which is, again, hermeneutically prior to experience, as a kind of prehension or pre-having. And he gets the idea of being with a capital B from Immanuel Kant's concept of what he calls the transcendental horizon. And what this means is that, again, for us to have the experience of the world that we have to already have certain, what Kant calls synthetic a priori, but don't worry about the meaning of that, certain categories in terms of which our experience is structured, have to already be, as it were, structuring our mind such that we can have the experience that we have. So this includes space and time as the categories within which we experience the world, and also things like causality or other types of cognitive categories that we then interpret things in terms of. Now, what's important to understand is that, so for example, space and time relate to the way that we experience the world, but reality as such doesn't necessarily fully encompass or isn't entirely describable in terms of the space and time that we subjectively experience the world as having. So, for example, we know from special relativity that time is not the mere universal sequence of events that we experience it cognitively as having. That if we want to talk about time as such, there is a causal sequence, but what rate that is occurring depends on the inertial frame of reference of the observer and is not the same universally. So our cognitive experience of time, which is as a kind of Newtonian time, a kind of universal container of events that's objectively real and everything, that's not actually what reality is like. But our cognitive experience, our framework of experiencing reality that way is close enough to how reality actually functions that we're able to have enough of a degree of fit with our construction of the world that we can navigate about in the world that we construct out of our experience. Likewise for space, we experience space as a container of physical events that has a uniform structure. But we know from general relativity that space is curved by mass. And so what that means is that we don't, because of our cognitive categories, directly perceive through our sensorium the curvature of space-time. Now, we can still understand that through a kind of complicated mathematical metaphor, but even though we experience space-time curvature all the time whenever we experience gravity, I don't experience this as space curvature when I sense it. Instead, I experience this as an object that begins to accelerate and move in space, which is not actually really what's happening. And the same with physical objects. So our cognitive categories construct a world experience where we encounter objects as fixed things in space and time that have a boundary and have what Descartes calls extended being. But we know that that is made up of quantum characteristics, quantum properties that are, the description of those is not directly reconcilable with our day-to-day experience. So what that means is that reality as it actually is in itself, as opposed to reality as it is for us as a world, reality as such or in itself is actually quite alien to our human existence. But we interpret it practically and historically in such a way that we're able to carve out or construct a kind of space of lived experience that can be interpreted in such a way that it's meaningful to us. And then that's the world that we live in. And in phenomenology, this is called the life world, the Lebenswelt. And I take this as being equivalent, which is not the same as reality as such, or the reality that's known by the physical sciences, but is rather the way that we live in the world by interpreting the world in a socially constructed way, such that we then appear within that world as subjects that have a certain identity and purpose. And so the life world or Lebenswelt, I take as equivalent to what Crowley calls the magical universe. And this is the universe that is, we magically construct for ourselves and then have to find our true will within. And this is a property of what's called the hadith, or what Crowley will call the point event, and we'll get to that in a moment in the text. So let me find where we are here. Now, what this means is that in phenomenology as well as in magic, the naive realist stance of objective empiricism has in some sense been inverted. In other words, rather than the world being the measure of objective truth, human existence is the source of the worldhood of the world. And this is to make this transition, which I think is the transition to the kind of Gnostic or magical perspective of looking at the world, but I also see it as equivalent to what's called the transcendental turn in modern philosophy, which is inaugurated by Immanuel Kant in his Critique of Pure Reason, is what he calls the Copernican revolution in philosophy. Whereas previous philosophies had treated the world as an objective reality that then determined what truth was, for Kant, that was instead going to pivot on the human observer rather than the observed. And so there's a kind of inversion, a Gnostic inversion that occurs. So this is, I'm interpreting the esoteric viewpoint of the Initiate of the Mysteries. This is the mystery that man is the measure of all things, as the ancient Greek philosophers said. And this is the Gnostic kind of insight that then, by building on that, we're able to create a coherent Gnostic philosophy of magic. And so that brings us back to Gnosticism of the Thelemic variety as a kind of anthropocentric, it's, in other words, the human person is the locus of spirit, defined as the meaningfulness of existence, and this is within the world. So it overcomes the dualism of the previous Osirian epoch in philosophy and religion, where the ground of meaning or being is projected into another world. And what I'm claiming is that Thelema is saying that it instead needs to be located in human existence within the world. And I see this also as equivalent to Ludwig Feuerbach's thesis from his book, The Essence of Christianity from 1844, very influential on development of critical theory, Marxism, and so forth, which is that the divine attributes that are described in exoteric religion, when philosophically understood or Gnostically esoterically understood, I'm claiming, are discovered to be attributes of the human spirit, which are projected into a fictional separate reality. And so magical initiation in a modern Thelemic sense involves the reappropriation in theory and in social practice of what had been our own alienated spiritual essence. And this is basically Crowley's argument in the second paragraph of his text, which we're now going to, boom, there we go. Okay. Brett, could you read the second paragraph, which starts, man is a microcosm?
I would love to read, but I'm currently driving.
Okay, Hillary, can you please,
yes,
can you please do us the favor of reading this second paragraph, man is a microcosm?
All right. Man is a microcosm, that is, an image concentrated around the point of consciousness of the microcosm or universe. This theorem is guaranteed by the hylo-idealistic demonstration that the perceptible universe is an extension or phantasm of the nervous system.
Okay, stop there. Let's talk about that. So, basically, the argument here is that the microcosm of human existence, man is a microcosm. Okay, but that's a reflection of the life world as the magical universe of the macrocosm. So these are flip sides of the same coin. Subject, object, person, world, the plane of the terrestrial elements, at the center of the universe, which consolidates the astral planetary influences of the solar system, which is, so you have the pentagram and the hexagram. Now in Thelemic terminology, this is the interplay between Hadith and Nuit. And this distinction is basic to Thelemic philosophy. And what I read Crowley's manner of symbolizing this distinction in terms of what in philosophy is known as the ontological difference, which is the distinction between being with a capital B and beings, plural with a lowercase b. So again, the ontological distinction, which is the difference between being and beings. And this distinction or difference was first explicitly thematized in Greek philosophy, especially in Aristotle's Metaphysics. And the ontological difference has been understood in diverse ways in the history of philosophy. So in medieval scholasticism, it was seen as the difference between God and creatures. In Platonism, it's the difference, or Neoplatonism rather, it's the difference between the supreme one that transcends the universe and material reality. For Heidegger, though, being with a capital B is neither the abstract genus of the universal, nor is it the apophatically undefinable, nor is it self-evidently obvious, nor is it the totality of nature, understood in a reductive materialist sense, nor does it exist in another world from this one. Rather, being with a capital B, the transcendental horizon that constructs the life world of our experience, is the product, or it is produced by the social skills and practices of human beings insofar as they exist historically. So for Heidegger, human existence, temporal self-becoming is its ontology. The way it is not merely an object like a rock, which only exists ontically. So the distinction between beings and beings can also be seen as the distinction between ontology or the ontological and a more practical category, which is that of the ontical. So basically the notion here is that in the type of modern philosophical thought that I'm identifying the thelemic approach with, the Platonic or metaphysical, Assyrian, exoteric, monotheistic concept of the human soul or essence or nature is replaced by the historicity of human existence, which is its temporality. So then these existential qualities of human existence, particularly historicity, I think can be read as being attributed to the Hadith principle, which can be, I think, associated with what Heidegger calls Dasein. So, for example, in the Book of the Law, chapter 2, verse 7, quote, "I am the axle of the wheel. Come unto me as a foolish word, for it is I that go." Meaning, in other words, that the Hadith principle is not a thing or object that can be located, but is rather an activity in time. And so if Nuit is substance, Hadith is time or activity within that world of objects and events. So again, this is the interaction of a humanly produced historicity with a world which then are kind of flip sides dialectically of the same coin. They're really the same thing seen from two different directions. And then this is being with a capital B. So then Nuit is then the life world, which is then able to appear, which then contains these particular phenomena. And then the third principle represented in the Book of the Law by Rahor Kawit is then the meaning of being, the meaning of that fusion of the two that has to be found, which is the true will, which is then expressed because then when we exist as being in the world, our being as such then becomes an issue for us. And then the solution to that question has to be solved, and that's the question of the aeon in Thelema, which defines the time within which we find ourselves for its participants. Okay, now, what on earth does Crowley mean by the phrase hylo-idealistic or hylo?
I was raising my hand. I was just about to ask that question.
Okay, let's look again at this second paragraph. This is guaranteed by the hylo-idealistic demonstration that the perceptible universe is an extension or phantasm of the nervous system. Okay. The phrase hylo-idealism comes from the philosophy associated with the collaboration of two late 19th century philosophers, Robert Lewins and Constance Naden. And so just to throw out a few books that they wrote, Robert Lewins wrote a book called Life and Mind in 1877, and Constance Naden wrote a book called Induction and Deduction in 1890. And their position, which is inspired by Herbert Spencer's Atheist and Scientific Materialism, which hylo-idealism basically is a monism which combines materialism with an atheist and human-centered idealism. So it's an attempt to combine materialism and idealism together, with the human being as kind of the pivot between the two. So let me give you a quote from Constance Naden, summing up her position. This is from Induction and Deduction, page 157, if you want to look it up. This book is online. Quote, Man is the maker of his own cosmos and all his perceptions. Even those which seem to represent solid, extended, and external objects have a merely subjective existence, bounded by the limits molded by the character and conditions of sentient being, unquote. Now, I think that it's possible to make too much about Crowley's particular use of the phrase hylo-idealistic or hylo-idealism. I think it's not meant in this context to be a dogmatic reference. In other words, it's not meant to say that this particular philosophy, hylo-idealism, is the truth, and then that's the method that we're following here. Rather, I think Crowley at this point is alluding to a philosophy that he thinks his readers might be familiar with as an example of the kind of approach that he is taking, rather than making a more specific argument. So in other words, I would take his general point here as being the same point made by, you could use the term transcendental idealist rather than hylo-idealist, for example. And the point then made by the sort of larger Kantian tradition, or the transcendental turn in modern philosophy, of which hylo-idealism is a type or example, would then be, and this would then be Crowley's broader point, that our experience consists of representations that are in us, that are cognitively constructed. That is to say, an extension or phantasm of the nervous system. And that these representations are a kind of phenomenological appearance, which have a kind of unity or holism as the world or as our experience. What gives it that quality does not just come from the experience of objective reality. It's something that as human beings, we are imparting to our experience. And that when we become cognizant of that, that the doorway is then open to investigating the nature and powers of our being such that we're able to have this power. And then the possibility of maybe of the discernment of the true will within that context might be possible. I think that that's what he means in this paragraph. Anyway, we need to move on. So we will, of course, have more to say about this. But I want to move on. So Christoph, could you possibly start reading this third paragraph? It follows that all phenomena.
Yeah, sure. It follows that all phenomena, internal and external, may be classified for the purpose of discussing their observed relations in any manner which experience may show to be the most convenient. Examples: the elaborate classifications of science, chemical, physical, etc., etc. There is no essential truth in any of these. Adds to thinking. Convenience is the sole measure. Now, for the purposes of analyzing the spiritual nature of man, of recording and measuring his experience and his kind, of planning his progress to the loftier heights of attainment, several systems have been devised.
Okay, let me get to, there we go. Robert, if you could pick up the top of the page here. No, Robert? Okay, Lance, could you read starting at the top of the page, that of where he talks about the Abhidharma?
That of the Abhidharma is on the surface alike the most practical, the most scientific, and the most real. But for European students, it is certainly far too unwieldy, to say nothing of other lines of criticism. Therefore, despite the danger of vagueness involved in the use of a system whose terms are largely symbolic, I have, for many reasons, preferred to present to the world as an international basis for classification the classico-mathematical system which is vulgarly and erroneously, though conveniently, called the Kabbalah. The Kabbalah, that is, the Jewish tradition concerning the initiated interpretation of their scriptures, is mostly either unintelligible or nonsense. But it contains as its ground plan the most precious jewel of human thought, that geometrical arrangement of names and numbers which is called the tree of life. I call it most precious because I have found it the most convenient method hitherto discovered of classifying the phenomena of the universe and recording their relations. Whereof the proof is the amazing fertility of thought which has followed my adoption of this scheme. Since all phenomena soever may be referred to the tree of life, which may be multiplied or subdivided at will for convenience sake, it is.
Stephen, if you could pick up.
It is evidently, what was it?
Useless.
Yeah, sorry, I was reading from my own copy on my screen. It is evidently useless to attempt to any complete account of it. The correspondence of each unit, the 10 Sephiroth and the 2 and 20 paths are infinite. The art of using it consists principally in referring all our ideas to it, discovering thus the common nature of certain things and essential differences between others, so that ultimately one obtains a simple view of the incalculably vast complexity of the universe. The whole subject must be studied in the book 777, the main attributions committed to memory. Then, when by constant use the system is at last understood, as opposed to being merely memorized, the student will find fresh light break on him at every turn as he continues to measure every item of new knowledge and he attains by the standard. For to him, the universe will then begin to appear as a coherent and necessary whole. For the purpose of studying these little essays, it will be sufficient if a bare outline of the cosmic theory which they imply be given, but it may be added that the fuller the comprehension of the tree of life which the reader brings to them, the clearer will their thought appear and the more cogent their conclusions.
Okay, so now it turns out that the cosmic theory is then the constitution of man, because the two are the same. The cosmos of the magical universe of the life world has its basis in the and is mirrored in and vice versa by the esoteric constitution of the human person. Now, how is this possible? It's possible because the transcendental horizon that is in us in terms of the cognitive frame that informs our experience, that then permits us to have our experience constructed in such a way that we experience the world as the way that it is constructed in and through language. And this is kind of the further insight of modern philosophy after Kant and so forth. As philosophers are analyzing the structure of the transcendental horizon, it becomes increasingly discovered in the 20th century in what's called the language turn in continental philosophy, that the transcendental horizon is semiotically structured. Jacques Lacan famously says that the unconscious is structured as a language, and this is what he means in part by that. But what that means is that if Ludwig Wittgenstein also famously, he says that the limits of my world are the limits of my language, is again another way of stating the same idea. Now, there's a magical thesis that can emerge from this insight, which is that if language makes the world, then language can be used to transform the world. And that's what magical spells do. In other words, it's like we're in framing the world by language, which is what Lacan calls the symbolic order, is something that we receive initially unconsciously through socialization. And so we're not initially in control of how we're programmed by language to experience the world as we do. But as we come into our own as subjects psychologically and develop self-consciousness, we can reappropriate that unconscious process and make it conscious. And this is what magic does, because magic specifically manipulates symbolism. Well, what's symbolism? Symbolism is language. What does it mean when we manipulate symbolism in magic in the way that we do? It means that we're reprogramming the transcendental horizon so that our true will can be more efficiently manifested, which otherwise the horizon is just incoherent. It's what we just inherit. It doesn't necessarily have the ordering that's optimal for our own self-expression of being, our own quest for authenticity. And so this is what magic allows us to do. And that's why it's called the science and art of causing change in conformity with will. Okay, why specifically Kabbalistic symbolism? Okay, first, what do we mean by this term? Harold Bloom defines the Kabbalah as a set of strategies for reading. In other words, Kabbalah is not only a philosophical language that has symbolism that describes the magical universe, it's also an approach to understanding what it means in the first place to have such a arrangement. So the value of the explicit and specific use of Kabbalah as the magical language of symbolic correspondences is due to, first, its history as a system of philosophical and spiritual speculation whose sources and purposes already align with those of modern magic. Two, it has, as a product of Jewish culture specifically, it has a certain historical alterity from the Greek metaphysical cultural tradition, which is also in dialogue with that tradition. And yet that alterity also offers a potentially critical difference or stance towards that tradition. So in other words, because of the historical difference, but also dialogue between Greek metaphysics and the Jewish Kabbalah, that there's a kind of already critical or evaluative stance towards the Greek metaphysical tradition that the Jewish Kabbalah has that becomes particularly useful in modernity, as the traditional dualisms of the Platonic tradition and the inheritance of the Greek metaphysical worldview are increasingly critiqued in modern philosophy. And Jewish thought and philosophy and culture becomes a kind of ally in that, whether that's represented by Freud or Marx or Baruch Spinoza, or there's a kind of Jewish cultural difference that allows for thinkers in that milieu to take up a usefully critical stance towards the larger culture that they're part of. And so the use of a specifically in that spirit, we can also be using Kabbalistic symbolism, not just to repeat the spirituality of the past eons, but also to update and critique them. Okay. We'll have more to say about that. Let's take a look at the Constitution of Man now. Let me again share my screen, and we're going to go through this quick, and I'm not going to read it because we're not going to read it through because we're running out of time. But what I'm instead going to do is I'm going to summarize it. So the Constitution of Man are the Kabbalistic parts of the soul. And remembering that it's the nature and powers of our own selves that are to be investigated. So what that means is that human beings are not just the mirror of being, according to the medieval mystical analogy that the soul is the mirror of God, but the human existence is itself the very ground of being with a capital B, in some sense that we need to understand or discern as we're proceeding through this course. And as such, the divine spirit comes to know itself in and as ourselves. So phenomenology offers a fully naturalized approach to describing magical attainment in these terms. Okay, so there's 5 principles. First, Yekida. This is what Crowley calls the point event, which is the basic hadith, purely abstract point of existence, which remains abstract until it constructs a magical universe for itself. In German idealism, this is called the transcendental subject, or absolute I that stands before and posits the phenomenal I in relation to the world as the not I, or object of experience. Okay, we're going to have a whole bunch more to say about what this is and means over the whole rest of the course. So I'm not going to spend a whole bunch of time now because we'll be revisiting all of these terms. I just want to lay out the categories. 2, Chia, pure willing or activity of the self, out of which the organization of experience into a subject and then into a world unfolds. Over the course of this class, I'm going to be relating this to Freud's death drive and to the Kabbalistic notion of Simsum, or the kind of primordial evacuation of the divine that allowed for the universe to then unfold. Again, I don't have time right now to fully develop that idea, but I'm just throwing it out because we're going to be talking about this again and again as we proceed. Chia is therefore also Hokmah as the word, which is the symbolic order of learned social language usages. And the construction of subjectivity is based on being imprinted with these, with the word, as it were, the symbolic order of language usages. And this occurs at the level of neshama, our third principle. And I identify this with what Lacan calls the imaginary with a capital I. And this is the unconscious structured as a language. The linguistic form of the transcendental horizon that is within our cognitive apparatus, whose form is to be recognized in the image of the true will. Then there's the abyss, which is the distinction between these ideal qualities, which are sort of semiotic and abstract and symbolic, and then the actual self-conscious constitution of the human subject. We will have more to say about the role of this category of the abyss as we proceed. Then comes the ruach. This is Freud's ego or self-conscious mind, whose faculties are organized by the imprint of the supernal principles into a subject or sense of coherent self-conscious identity, which accrues experience. And then finally, there's the nefesh, which is Freud's id, the libidinal economy of the subject, which governs the expressions of affectivity. So this is more formally the unconscious as a kind of inchoate, libidinal, the messy signals that we get in dreams and the automatic functioning of our mind that's kind of below the level of self-consciousness. And then the chapter ends on an aspirational note about how initiation is started by the vision of sorrow, which we will talk about next week. And so I'm going to sort of skim over that. And then he talks about how, yea, verily, initiation is tireless, and its joys without bound, for the whole universe and all that's in it is but the infinite playground of the crowned and conquering child, the insatiable, the innocent, and ever-rejoicing heir of space and eternity, whose name is man. Great, wonderful. We've got about 5, 6, 7 minutes left. So we've obviously covered a bunch of material, and we're going to talk a whole bunch more about all of these categories. So in this first class, all I'm doing is just laying out the basic categories. And then we're going to go more in depth and have plenty of time for questions and answers and so forth. So my hope is to have more time for questions as we proceed, maybe more like 15 or 20 minutes. We had less time for that this class session because I had to lay out the material and get the ball rolling. But we've still got about 6 or 7 minutes. So I want to open to questions at this point. Just unmic your mic and go ahead and ask if you've got any questions or comments as we come to the sort of final part of this first session. Questions, comments? Somebody is confused, I know. Somebody has some concept that they don't want me to say a little bit more of this time around because it's not quite clear what I mean.
Oh, I mean, I think from my point of view, you gave a lot of the groundwork in philosophy, which maybe I wasn't familiar with. So I think there is just like a lot to take in.
Yes.
When it comes to that, but otherwise, like given that contextualized view, that was like very illuminating to like read this chapter because previously when reading this, I lacked all that context. So that's at least my comment there that was a very elucidating lecture on the foundation of this chapter where having read several other things which describe these parts of the soul, I think I probably skimmed this and didn't take as much meaning from it the first several times I read it. So that's
sure. And we did go a little bit too fast through it. And again, we'll be revisiting those. Hillary, you've on mic. Do you have anything you wanted to ask?
Oh, no, I just a similar comment. I feel like I've been trying to drink from a fire hose. I know absolutely nothing about philosophy.
Okay, good.
And I came into this course because please, somebody make Crowley make sense to me.
Yes.
So I'm looking forward to this.
Okay, great. So when I'm talking about like this thing called I'm throwing out these technical terms, transcendental horizon, being with a capital B. Does that make sense to you, what I'm trying to get at with that?
I am doing my best to follow it. I'm also trying to let it sort of sink into my
Sure.
subconscious so that, by next week, I'll have possibly a better idea when we continue on.
Sure. I guess what I'm trying to do, if I wanted to sort of summarize it again, is that from a thelemic point of view, a magical point of view, the Eon of Osiris, the previous era of exoteric, monotheistic, colonialist, imperialist religion, is characterized by kind of dualism. We exist as human beings with like this thing called a soul in this world, and then everything that's like supposed to be God or the spiritual is in this metaphysically other world. And so I think the impulse for modern philosophy, as well as for Crowley's magic, is to try to collapse or overcome this difference. And that's like the Gnostic impulse, so that rather than God being or the divine being another world, we can find the divine within ourselves, that we're the expression of that. What we mean when we use God talk, when we talk about the spirit or divinity or spirituality, we're talking about ourselves as spiritual beings, but then as a type of existence that is not just reducible to bare material presence of stuff, because that had been what was correct about the Osirian philosophies that had criticized that possibility, that there's something right about the idea that what makes us special as human beings can't just be reduced to physical objects in the world being pushed together to make something.
Yeah, there's a really interesting modern book called Galileo's Error, which talks about how, Galileo being the, modern father of science, basically classified things, anything that wasn't like position, velocity, somewhere in space like that, like delegated things like color and emotion to things of the soul, and everything else was like, completely separate from this thing that we could measure, and he kind of like defined it away, which is like an interesting viewpoint here, because it's taking that and saying like, well, we're not defining it away. We're actually like integrating that into our worldview, as opposed to just saying that like, oh, we can't measure this in the same way, so let's just not even consider it.
Yes, and that becomes the whole basis for the worldview associated with early science in the modern period, particularly with René Descartes and Isaac Newton. And there emerges by the 19th century a kind of reductive, mechanistic, deterministic worldview. Now, all of that's disrupted in the early 20th century by relativity and the new physics that emerge. And then there's the new psychology and the new philosophy and the new magic, the new spirituality that then emerges at that time, that Crowley's part of that. I'm trying to locate Crowley as part of that conversation that then is critiquing that that approach. And we're going to have a whole bunch more to say about that as we move forward, but we're now at 4 o'clock. And so our class is finished, but we will be resuming this next week. And these are all recorded, so you can go back and review stuff. And I'll be sending the link to the recording as soon as I get it. And anyway, everybody have a nice week. And we'll meet again next week to keep going with this book. Okay.
Thank you, Nathan. This was really amazing. Really appreciate it.
Okay, great. Love is the law, love under.
93.
93.